Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skill. In Season 7, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journey. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneur mindset and drive. On this episode, we're joined by Chad Lubelsky, who is currently the Vice President of Strategy, Impact, and Development at Volunteer Canada, where he leads strategy, development, and implementation of new models and pathways for volunteering and civic participation by centering belonging and inclusion. Chad has 20 plus years of working in social change. He actually started his career as a journalist before pivoting to nonprofits. Today, Chad sits down with Scott to offer his insights and perspectives on the role of post-secondary institutions.
I am incredibly excited to have Chad Lubelsky on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship, this afternoon. I've known Chad for, at this point, probably 6 or 7 years in a wide range of different places, and have gotten to know Chad very well. And I would say that Chad is one of the people who knows more about the post-secondary sector in Canada than almost any other individual that I've been able to come across in Canada. And I would also say one of the things about you, Chad, is that you are one of the kindest, most thoughtful and considerate people. And I don't say this to every single guest, but you are an incredibly kind and empathetic person. And I'll stop making you uncomfortable here, but really excited to have you on the podcast.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So related to the intro comment, one of the issues that we consider a lot at Venture for Canada is the role that post-secondary institutions play in Canadian society. And the recognition that post-secondary institutions do so much more than train or educate people, but have a really complicated and nuanced role in Canadian society. But before we dive into the role of post-secondary institutions within Canada, Chad, can you give a high-level overview about your career to date and some of the ways that you've gained experience in with the post-secondary institution sector in Canada?
Sure, no problem. And it's nice to be here. So my career to date has been varied. I've worked as a journalist, I've worked in the community sector, I've worked as a teacher, and I've also graduated from a number of post-secondary institutions. And I worked most specifically in post-secondary. I worked for the Canada Millennium Scholarship Foundation, which was Canada's Millennium Project. It was a foundation created by the federal government for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010, with a mandate to increase access to post-secondary. And I worked very specifically on our community engagement programs. So I actually led for 5-6 years a scholarship program that gave scholarships for students who were very engaged in their communities. And I developed leadership programs for them. And 2 actually of my ex-students who I ended up marrying, I didn't marry them, I officiated their wedding, are coming over for dinner tonight. So it's great timing to ask that question. And then I worked for community organizations where we worked with post-secondary institutions doing community engagement projects. And most recently, during my time at McConnell, which is a private family foundation, and a foundation, in this instance, we're a charity that supports other charities, we worked a lot with post-secondary institutions on funding and capacity development programs.
A wide breadth of experiences. And I think the Canadian Millennium Scholarship Program is an excellent one that people should learn more about, and I encourage our listeners to Google more about it if you're not aware of the scholarship program. And by the way, I can relate to the the joy of when you connect 2 different folks together who end up getting married. I was just at an engagement event a couple of weeks ago for a few Venture for Canada fellows who met through the program.
Great. I bet lots do. Yeah.
And it's a very nice feeling. And I think it's a testament to how educational experiences bring lots of other benefits in terms of networks, which often yield friendships, but also can yield like lifelong partnerships in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to meet people you wouldn't normally meet, right?
Absolutely, which is a good segue to what is the role of post-secondary institutions in Canada. And when most people think about post-secondary institutions, and for context of our listeners, what is a post-secondary institution? A post-secondary institution is post-secondary. So that's somewhat a tautology, but it's to say post-high school. So that can be a college, that can be a university, that can be a cégep, that can be a polytechnic. There's many different kinds of post-secondary institutions within Canada. And my question for you, Chad, to start off this conversation around the role of post-secondary institutions in Canada is, what is the role of post-secondary institutions beyond teaching and research?
Post-secondary institutions have a crucial role to play in supporting social and economic development. And Canada consistently ranks very well in OECD studies and in mobility because of our very strong post-secondary system. So Canada has a very established university system, and we have a very established college system. And one of the reasons we have more mobility, we need more. I'm not saying our mobility is perfect, and by some statistics, our wealth gap is widening. But at the same time, for an OECD country, we do quite well. And one of the reasons we have that is because of our very entrenched college system. So the college system was founded in the 1960s to help address a labor shortage. And it's continued on in being very applied and in helping address very local labor needs, right? So supporting local businesses to have students to get trained so they have jobs in those communities. So a concrete economic benefit for post-secondary institutions. There's a whole other type of category of role for post-secondary institutions. So they would, all post-secondary institutions have as their three foci research. Not all have research, but the vast majority have research, teaching and learning. And then there's a third one, which is the social. And so often that might be grouped under community engagement, but it's about civic footprint. And there it's thinking about the role of a post-secondary institution, college, university, or cégep, in supporting the community around it to be successful, right? So in other words, tying its success to its community, however it might define community. Generally that's geographic, but it doesn't exclusively have to be. So what does it mean then for a post-secondary institution to say we can only be successful if the people around us are successful, and really increasing their social and economic and cultural well-being? So there's a myriad of examples of that. I can go into that if you want, but it's tying institutional success to community success.
Yeah, I think it would be great to dive into perhaps like a specific example to further illustrate the impact that post-secondary institutions can have on their communities. Chad, can you, recognizing like there are many post-secondary institutions that have a tremendous impact on their communities, and I like picking one's favorite child potentially in the sense that it's a somewhat of an impossible question. But can you speak about focus on one specific post-secondary institution and use it as a case study of how post-secondary institutions can provide a significant positive impact on a given community?
Sure. What I might do is I might use a couple of different schools with different themes, if that works. Okay. So for example, the University of Winnipeg, in downtown Winnipeg, they have something called the Community Renewal Corporation. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to support individuals within the Winnipeg community who maybe struggle to have jobs or to be gainfully employed. They integrate them into the workforce within the University of Winnipeg. And so that they do that through something called the Community Renewal Corporation. So there, it's the university saying in their procurement and in their hiring, they're saying we have a responsibility to our greater community to ensure that it's not just the students who benefit from the dollars that we spend, but it's also the wider members of the community. So everybody benefits from the fact that this major institution, this anchor institution, is within our community. Another example, Vancouver Island University, which is on Vancouver Island on the West Coast, I think they have 7 campuses up and down Vancouver Island. There's something called the Canada Learning Bond, which is a mechanism by which students in Canada can access matching funds from the federal government for post-secondary. There's very low take-up for this program. So Vancouver Island University goes to elementary schools and supports the students and the parents to start getting into the stream to get this money, because they know that's when the decision is made about whether or not to go to post-secondary, and having the financial capacity to do it is a major part of deciding whether or not people actually go to post-secondary. I'll give you one more example. There's Yukon College, now Yukon University, also several campuses sprinkled throughout the Yukon. They have something called, the specific name, I might get this a little bit wrong, but it's the Center for First Nations Governance. And so Yukon, I think in 1973 was the first territory that signed independent governance agreements nation to nation with the government of Canada. So Yukon has expertise in self-governance that the rest of the country does not have. And so the way they are working with their community is they're codifying how they're doing that and supporting other First Nations in learning from the Yukon experience, so that First Nations throughout Canada are able to exercise their own inherent rights to self-governance.
One issue that I'm thinking a little bit about is I am a huge believer about the positive impact of post-secondary institutions. At the same time, sometimes I have seen how post-secondary institutions can be, at their worst, bubbles and kind of separated from the communities that they're in. That there is a reason why sometimes that there can be the moniker of ivory towers that of separate. So my question to you, Chad, is how can post-secondary institutions overcome the ivory tower and ensure that there are strong linkages between the post-secondary institution itself and the community that they operate in? By the way, I recognize people write whole books on this subject, but I'm giving you a very complicated question for a relatively short podcast.
Yeah, well, I would come at that question in two ways. So first, I would say some might suggest that we need the ivory tower, right? And that ivory tower does serve a function, right? It lets academics be independent and to do the research that advances our knowledge base, both here in Canada and abroad. Is it possible the ivory tower has gotten a bit too tall and a bit too, not difficult to get into? Probably, right? But that might be for others to decide. In terms of what they can do about it, those that want to do something about it, I think there's something about, post-secondary institutions are 600, universities specifically, are 600-year-old institutions. Some have become quite adept at adapting and listening to the community and are curious and interested in producing knowledge that's applied. And so not stopping at, I just want to know something for the sake of knowing. And there can be value in that for a subset of people, but for most people, that's not sufficient. So I think there is something about the way post-secondary institutions start to change is when they ask, who is this serving? And if it's themselves, then acknowledging that and being transparent about it. But if it's others, then you start to ask questions like, well, what is the demand? How are they accessing it? What is the pathways for change? Who is ultimately going to use it? What are we learning? How is this evolving over time, et cetera, right? So by being in relationship with the community, and that could be geography, that could be people, that could be thematic, there's all sorts of ways of defining community, but being in relationship with it where it's actually reciprocal, right? And there's a rebalancing of power, that starts to change the nature of the institution. Because once the walls come down and once things become permeable, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? It's open, and that fundamentally changes the way of working and the way of being and the way of understanding your role and your responsibilities.
More tangibly, how can universities how can post-secondary institutions rebalance that power with communities?
Would you say rebalance power with communities, maybe putting more money into communities' hands or more resources to community hands for decision making?
Yeah, in essence, recalibrate that relationship. Like as you were kind of talking about the importance of post-secondary institutions meaningfully engaging with communities so that they feel that their voices are in essence like heard within the institutions. What are some specific kind of concrete ways that post-secondary institutions can ensure that there is that kind of that the voice of the community is actually heard listened and acted upon within that institution?
I mean, I think like many institutions, it starts with governance, right? You need to look at how an organization is governed and who makes decisions about how resources are expended. So at a very high level, at a university administration and structure level, that's where I would start. But then I think that there are ways and mechanisms within the current structure even just to start those changes. So one way of doing it, universities all have strategic plans, right? And universities can often be very, I always mispronounce this word, hierarchical structures. And so if you put the community engagement or rebalancing of power with community in the strategic plan, then all of a sudden you're accountable for it, right? And then you need to start to create pathways to create those changes. So if I can give you a concrete example, Carleton University, their strategic plan. So I've read many strategic plans of schools across the country. They all mention community. Many of them will not actually specifically identify what community they're talking about when they say community. For Carleton, for example, really gets very specific on what they mean by community, and they talk about their physical location, they talk about the river, they talk about their history and what they want to be doing for community. So once you put something out there, you're all of a sudden, one, everybody knows that that's the vision and the mission, and two, you're accountable for it, and then three, you're sort of, I think, interpelled, like you're called upon to do it. So some might say it'll start, there's a couple ways to do this. Some might say it'll start at the top with the vision and the leadership and the governance, and that's one part of it. Others will say it needs to start at the bottom with just individual activities and engaging in reciprocal activities with community and others. My own take is it needs to happen from both places. There needs to be mechanisms for that work to happen in both areas. And the last thing that I would say is I think community needs to ask for it. And if things aren't working for people, those on the inside might not always see it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there has to be a party willing to engage with the university. And that party needs to put in the work as well. One issue with post-secondary institutions, which is often not super widely known, is the extent that post-secondary institutions funding in Canada has significantly shifted over the last 30 to 40 years. That 40 years ago, most post-secondary institutions in Canada were predominantly funded by provincial government operating grants. And many post-secondary institutions still are, in particular colleges. Some of them are as much as 70, 80% funded by government at the very highest levels. But on the flip side, many, for instance, universities, like I believe University of Toronto, it's now only maybe approximately 15%. 20% of their total operating revenue comes from provincial government grants. And many post-secondary institutions, you can literally see these charts, and they're just the amount of money coming from the provincial governments keeps on going down and down, and the amount of money coming from fees goes up and up, and also other kind of sources of income. So, in the sense of follow the money and understand how money impacts priorities, including for post-secondary institutions. How do you think the significant changes in the way that post-secondary institutions earn their revenue over the last 30, 40 years impacts those post-secondary institutions' priorities or activities? Or potentially it's a loaded question and it doesn't.
So the big increase in student fees is from international students, right? There's international students, there's a lot more international students, and they pay, the way the fee structure works in Canada, as I know you know, is in most provinces, the provincial students pay one rate, Canadian students then, or out-of-province students pay another rate, and then international students pay the most expensive rate. And so the large part of the increase in funding comes from international students. So I think the answer to that question depends on the school, right? So, the international students often will afford the school more discretion, right? Because a provincial grant will often be tied to a specific area of activity, whereas tuition fees, it's more, the students need to get their education, but there's much more discretion in how you spend it. So in some senses, the schools have more latitude, but then they're also under a lot more pressure to ensure that those enrollments keep up. So if I was running a post-secondary institution in Canada and thinking about, how the revenue stream has changed, I would be, I believe, more interested in, there isn't always a direct link between cost of tuition and rates of post-secondary attendance. So in my own province of Quebec, and this is just a bit of a tangent, in my own province of Quebec, which has the lowest fees in the country, it also has among the lowest rates of post-secondary attendance. And so one of the things that I'd be looking at is, what is the relationship between fees and other services to who's actually coming to the school in order to ensure that there is access, as much access as possible. And I would be thinking about, as I ran my institution, what is the ultimate mission and vision of the work we're trying to do, and what latitude do I have to spend the money that I need to spend in order to do it?
I could do a whole podcast episode just on the international student piece. It's just a good segue. It's something we've seen at Venture for Canada, and we're thinking about programming around helping international students enter into the workforce. But I also wrote a Globe and Mail article in early 2022 on this topic, and it's something that I think that international students are a huge asset to Canada, and I think it's recognizing that Canada benefits incredibly from international students, as well as international students in many cases benefiting coming to Canada. But zooming in on education, one tension that I sometimes see in the post-secondary education sector, and I would say more so universities, is this: are universities training people for jobs, or are they training people for like careers or life? And every program is different. Every university, I think, is a little bit different on this issue. But how do you think post-secondary institutions kind of at large should consider that balance between training people for jobs and training people for life in general?
I would gently reject the dichotomy or the binary equation, if I can say, right? Because one doesn't preclude the other. That said, everybody goes to post-secondary for different reasons, right? And sometimes you might just want those really hard, specific skills to do X, Y, and Z, whatever that might happen to be. And, a post-secondary institution is a great place to do it. That's more common for older students or students returning to school, et cetera, et cetera. I do think, however, that post-secondary institutions do have a really strong role to play in critical thinking and in the development of what sometimes are called life skills and critical thinking, but really I would suggest empathy and relationship building skills. It's if I look at what's going on in Canada today and our increasing polarization and our increasing incapacity to speak to each other, to communicate, to understand each other, or even just to try and listen. I think post-secondary institutions have a role to play in helping us better understand each other and being able to communicate. Because I think it's desperately needed. And frankly, I don't know who else is going to do it. So if they don't step up and step in to those spaces, it makes me even more worried about it, right? Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, I think there is something about that we're increasingly lacking of a shared empathy and a shared humanity for all of us across the country. And even just, and I would end on this, building an understanding of what our country is.
Oh, and I think there can be so much more empathy and understanding when you work directly with people who have completely different lived experiences. That one person through this program that I'm working with who lives in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, which is like a rural community outside of Regina. And I was just joking about Toronto being center of the universe, and I could tell it's but there was a little bit. I traditionally don't work with people in rural Saskatchewan, and likewise, he doesn't usually work with people who live in Toronto. And I think that there can be a lot more shared understanding through those kinds of programs. And to link back to the topic of post-secondary institutions, I think that is one of the ways post-secondary institutions can really positively impact people, is to expose people to people from outside of their communities not just in terms of province, but also from around the world, as increasingly there are more
And
international students.
Scott, if I might, I don't think it's just about geography. I think it's about background. So, for example, I did the leadership program at Royal Roads University, and my background of most organizations was consensus-based, very non-hierarchical. And when I got there, we were paired with a buddy, and my buddy was a fire chief. And through working with the fire chief, I really came to understand the benefits of command and control. And that is a leadership model, and when that's needed. So he broadened my horizons in an extremely helpful way about the limits of how I thought decisions should be made, like when that didn't work, and how other ways of working and of being can be incredibly helpful in certain situations. And I would never have understood that if I didn't have that direct experience through a post-secondary institution of meeting somebody from a completely different background and life experience.
Do you think post-secondary institutions have work to do on fostering a climate where people of mainstream kind of political views can express their different feelings?
Yes, I mean, we all have work to do on that, right? Every individual, every organization, every institution in this country, that's our work. So 100%. I think there might be two aspects to this question. So one aspect is a little bit like what I was saying earlier. What is the role of post-secondary institution in just building empathy and building those skills where we're listening and able to converse with people we disagree with, which is fundamentally a core life skill, right? It's very difficult to go through the world if you're not able to engage with people you disagree with. Then I do think there's a second part, and again, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, where we need to be making space for divergent viewpoints. And I think universities and colleges can be a model for that, right? Because traditionally they were the place where ideas were debated. And if we're no longer able to have a healthy debate, right, that is about ideas and not people, right? Because too often those things degenerate into attacking individuals as opposed to ideas. But I'm not sure where else that would happen, right? And the other thing is, I think post-secondary institutions have a threshold for risk, right? They can experiment with it, they can try and see, does this work, does that work, right? Because they are established institutions with, I'm not saying their funding is perfect and they don't have funding challenges, but they do have, some confidence, a good deal of confidence in a continuation of their revenue stream. So they can, say like, okay, how can we engage with Canadians? It doesn't have to be Canadians, but just the people in our community in new and meaningful ways to support greater dialogue, or at least some dialogue, depending on the community you're in.
Well, it reminds me of what we were chatting about in the pre-show, which was the role that universities play in general in fostering a democratic or democracy and pluralism in general, and how often when autocrats are rising to power, some of the first institutions that they target are post-secondary institutions. How do you think, kind of going back to that democracy and pluralism place, and as we think about the vitality of Canadian democracy going into the future, what are some additional ways that post-secondary institutions can potentially revitalize Canadian democracy and pluralism?
I think there's probably a couple of things. So one is I think the research becomes very important here, right? I think they can help us better understand the state of democracy. And by democracy, just to be really clear, I don't mean voting, right? Voting is a one piece of a democratic society. But when I think of a democratic society, I think of a society where everybody has agency, so decision-making power and influence over the things that affect their lives, right? And is engaged. So they can do research into helping us understand the state of our democracy and what needs to change. And then they can also help with help design mobilization campaigns to support that change. So, for example, Canada's voting system, many would suggest, myself included, is fundamentally broken with our first past the post system. Right. So here in Quebec, we just had a provincial election. The Conservative Party of Quebec received 13% of the votes, no seats in the House. That is abhorrent, regardless of what you think about their political views. And it doesn't bode well then for our future if we have 13% of Quebecers who feel they have no representation in our parliament. So they can do the research, they can help mobilize campaigns to figure out how to actually change first past the post, right? Because there's a bit of a mindset block with that, where for some reason in Canada, we think it's too complicated to change it, and it'll create a real messy result. Not that messy is necessarily a bad thing. And I think they can also support in the training and the education of the next generation of people who will be in leadership positions to have a larger view of engagement, of democracy, of what it means to live in a thriving country that moves beyond a certain ideology. And then finally, what we were talking about the whole time, or not the whole time, but just to be a forum or an agora for the free exchange of ideas. And lots of schools do this, right? They host public talks and things like that. But then, there's only one segment of the population that often comes, right? And so what can they do? And I think they do have a role and a responsibility to play in trying to be much more accessible. So and I'll end on this, for example, Concordia University, I think they still have it, I don't know if they still do, for many years had a program called University of the Streets Cafe, right? Where they went into, it was literally that, they went into cafes around the city of Montreal, engaging the local community in questions that mattered to them, right? And all of this helps build a country and a community based on dialogue and democracy and engagement, which then becomes the conditions or sets the stage for greater societal change.
To kind of wrap things up a little bit, Chad, as you think about the post-secondary institutions at large in Canada, what do you think are the greatest challenges facing these institutions? And then conversely, what do you think are the greatest opportunities that post-secondary institutions face in Canada?
So it's hard to paint the entire sector with a broad brush, right? But I think many would suggest that for some universities, there's a crisis of credibility. There's a lot of money that is spent on them, and the degree to which individual Canadians have a return on their investment, I think is increasingly questioned. So Canadian universities need to increasingly justify, I think, the work they do, why they do it, and who they do it for. And this is connected to funding and their programs, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, I think some of it does really boil down to credibility. And we see this in some provincial governments that do actually seem quite hostile to their post-secondary institution. There's an expression, sometimes I work in philanthropy, and there's an expression sometimes in philanthropy, which is never let a good crisis go to waste. Right, and that speaks a little bit to what sometimes we call, they call the Overton window. So it's, Scott, as I'm sure you know, it's the window where all of a sudden the opportunity to do something becomes wider, right? So at the beginning of COVID, the Overton window opened, around greater labor justice. It very quickly closed, right? And we don't have the labor justice that we could have had. But if universities in Canada are entering a period of crisis, then I think a window of opportunity opens up for them to really rethink their mandate and rethink how they're engaging with community, to, in a sense, to put it bluntly, to justify their existence and the money that is spent on them, and not be seen as just a vehicle for the elite to maintain their elite status. And I think that's more specific to universities than it is to colleges. I think colleges, for those who engage with the college system, have tend to have a more favorable view and a more favorable experience in it. And that's directly because colleges are often much more connected to their local community and local community needs.
What are some of the mechanisms in which colleges are more connected to their local communities?
Often they can be smaller, right? So that helps, right? The size sometimes of universities, can be a hindrance. There are some very large colleges in Canada, so it's not just about size. Think about half of colleges in Canada have an active community college committee, right, where community members are actually invited in to make decisions about how the community or how the services the school is offered is supportive of community. Colleges are they're much more applied in their learning. They're newer, so they're much more nimble. I think they don't have this 600-year-old history to draw upon. They're scrappier, right? When we say post-secondary in Canada, we think of universities, but colleges, they are like the little brother or the little sister that is always trying to, in a certain sense, and I mean this in the most complimentary way, to punch above their weight, right? So they are much more connected to community and to listening because they have to be. And so as a result, they understand their community and they understand what services they can be offering that universities don't always. If you talk to, generally speaking, and this is a massive generalization, if you talk to a college, you say, what's your community? They'll say the community that they're part of, right? So Centennial will say, well, Scarborough, as an example, in Ontario, just outside Toronto. Whereas universities will often say, well, our community is global, right? So if you look at McGill here in Montreal, and it's not at all to pick on McGill, but if you look at McGill here in Montreal and say, well, our community is global, then it's sort of natural then that Montrealers might not, who don't have a direct relationship with McGill, might then say like, well, McGill isn't actually relevant for Montreal. And they themselves are saying our community is global.
Agreed. And we've tried to learn from colleges to some extent at Venture for Canada in creating some of those formalized mechanisms for feedback. Like two ways we've done it is, one is through an employer advisory council, and two is through a formalized alumni council that is quite active. And that came out of research of some of the best practices of what colleges do, like having those, like rather than, you can engage folks, but process matters, repeatable processes matter. And I think it is an important thing for post-secondary institutions to think about, is beyond, here's a community survey, we're kind of getting your input. What are formalized mechanisms to ensure that you are listening to the community's feedback and really getting their input? One other thing to share, a senior person at a university once said this to me, is the importance of thinking globally, acting locally, which is a saying that many people have used, but I think it is an interesting one to think about in terms of the post-secondary institution sector. And I think it's I think I would actually say you can think global, act local, and global potentially as a slight edit, but it's to say that even if you're the most globalized institution, out there, if you're Harvard or whatever, it still makes sense to be grounded in your community and to be thinking locally to some extent.
Do you know what? Can I just say one other thing here? On how it's the nature of the relationship with their students and their community and the mission of the school. So our rankings in Canada of schools are based on who they exclude, right? So the more people you exclude, the higher your ranking is going to be, right? It's not quite as black and white as that, but often that can be the case, right? They talk about, the averages of people that come in, et cetera, et cetera. There's a school in Florida, I think it's Florida State University. I don't remember the name, but I heard a talk from their president who talked about how they wanted to be ranked on, anybody who applies gets in, and they wanted to be ranked on what they do with the students once they enter. And it's a radical reframe of what makes for a good school, right? And what is the role of an institution. And I get it. I get the first part, right? That sometimes there is an element of, for lack of a better word, exclusion, and part of the responsibility of some of the major universities in Canada is to train our doctors and our architects, et cetera, but there is another role, right? And it is a role of radical inclusion and then supporting people to live into their full potential. And I think the schools that do that will be the ones that will be ultimately the most successful in the future. I really hope so.
I think that that is the perfect way to end off this interview. Some really interesting food for thought about what does the future of post-secondary institutions look like in Canada, how their impact is so much more beyond research and education. And while those are important, but it's to say that from economic development to community development to fostering democracy, there are so many ways that post-secondary institutions influence our society, and the health of our post-secondary institutions is critical for, I think, the functioning of an effective and healthy and vibrant country. Thank you so much for coming on the Venture for Canada podcast this afternoon.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture.canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sturrett and Chad Lubelsky. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah, and editing and mixing are also done by Latifa Farah. Basola Agamba is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast.